The year was 1944. On a remote Pacific island, Colonel Takeshi Yamamoto stood before the largest cache of American fuel his forces had ever captured. 25,000 gallons of high-octane aviation fuel, neatly stored in hundreds of steel drums, each one bearing the unmistakable stamp of American industrial might. As he watched his men roll barrel after barrel into their makeshift depot, something profound began to dawn on him. This wasn't just fuel. It was a revelation that would shake his understanding of the war itself. But Colonel Yamamoto wasn't celebrating. Instead, as he calculated the staggering implications of what lay before him, a cold realization crept into his mind. If the Americans could abandon this much precious fuel in a single retreat, fuel his own air force desperately rationed drop by drop, what did that say about their enemy's true capabilities? The Pacific War had been raging for nearly 3 years, and Japan's early victories had given way to an increasingly desperate defensive struggle. But it would take this one moment, standing among those gleaming fuel drums, for a seasoned Japanese officer to truly comprehend the industrial juggernaut his nation was fighting against. This is the story of how 25,000 gallons of abandoned American fuel became a window into Japan's inevitable defeat, and how one colonel's shocking realization reflected the broader awakening happening across the Japanese military leadership in the war's final years. To understand the significance of Colonel Yamamoto's discovery, we must first journey back to December 7, 1941, when Japan launched its surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. The Japanese military leadership, led by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto and General Hideki Tojo, had calculated their chances carefully. They knew they couldn't match America's industrial capacity in a prolonged war, but they believed they wouldn't need to. The strategy was audacious in its simplicity: deliver such devastating blows to American forces in the Pacific that the United States would sue for a negotiated peace, allowing Japan to keep its newly conquered territories. Like a smaller, faster boxer, hoping to land a knockout punch before his larger opponent could use his reach and power, Japan bet everything on swift, decisive victories. And at first, it worked brilliantly. Within 6 months of Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces had conquered the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, Hong Kong, Singapore, and had pushed deep into the Central Pacific. American, British, and Dutch forces seemed to crumble before the Japanese war machine. The rising sun flag flew over territories spanning from the Aleutian Islands to the edge of Australia. But even in those heady days of victory, observant Japanese officers began noticing troubling details. When they overran American bases, they found warehouses packed with equipment, fuel dumps that seemed impossibly large, and supply depots that suggested a level of material abundance that was almost incomprehensible to soldiers accustomed to making do with less. Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka, serving with the Japanese forces that captured Wake Island, would later write in his diary, "The Americans left behind more ammunition than our entire regiment carries. In their mess halls, we found canned foods from dozens of different companies we had never heard of. How many factories do they have?" It was a question that Japanese intelligence officers were asking with increasing urgency. Pre-war estimates of American industrial capacity had been based on Depression-era production figures, but as 1942 progressed, intercepted radio communications and captured documents began painting a very different picture. The Americans weren't just recovering from Pearl Harbor, they were mobilizing on a scale that defied Japanese understanding. Consider the numbers that were becoming apparent to Japanese planners by mid-1942. In 1940, before the war, the United States had produced about 6,000 aircraft. Japanese intelligence had calculated that American aircraft production might reach 20,000 planes per year by 1943. The actual figure would exceed 85,000 aircraft in 1943 alone. The disconnect wasn't just significant, it was catastrophic for Japanese planning. But abstract production numbers were one thing. It was the concrete evidence of American abundance that truly shook Japanese officers in the field. Captain Kenji Nakamura, serving with Japanese forces in the Solomon Islands, witnessed American supply operations firsthand during the Guadalcanal campaign. They would land supplies on the beach and use bulldozers, machines we had seen in peacetime construction. As if they were ordinary tools of war, they had bulldozers to spare for moving supplies, while we were still using hand tools and pack animals. The fuel situation was perhaps the most telling indicator of all. Japan had entered the war partly to secure access to the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, because the home islands produced virtually no petroleum. Every drop of fuel had to be imported, refined, and carefully distributed. Japanese pilots trained on severely limited fuel rations, and experienced pilots were precious resources that couldn't be replaced. American pilots, by contrast, seemed to have unlimited training time. Intercepted communications revealed that American flight schools were producing pilots by the thousands, with training programs that consumed more fuel in a single month than some Japanese air units received in a year. The qualitative implications were staggering. While Japanese pilots were forced to conserve fuel and limit their training flights, American aviators were logging hundreds of hours in increasingly sophisticated aircraft. Colonel Takeshi Yamamoto had witnessed this abundance firsthand during the fighting on Saipan in 1943. As the Americans advanced across the Central Pacific, their supply lines demonstrated a logistical capability that seemed almost supernatural to Japanese observers. Ships arrived daily, unloading not just ammunition and food, but luxuries that Japanese soldiers hadn't seen since the war began: fresh fruit, ice cream, even magazines and newspapers printed just days earlier in California. "They fight a different kind of war," Yamamoto had written to his wife during the Saipan campaign. "Their soldiers complain if their food is not fresh, while our men consider themselves fortunate to have rice. Their wounded are evacuated in flying hospitals to bases with full medical facilities, while ours must make do with basic field aid stations." But it wasn't just the scale of American material superiority that troubled thoughtful Japanese officers. It was the casual way Americans seemed to treat resources that Japan considered precious. During the retreat from Guadalcanal, American forces had abandoned equipment rather than waste time moving it. Perfectly functional vehicles, aircraft parts, communication equipment, all left behind as if they were disposable. This casual abandonment of valuable military resources spoke to a manufacturing capacity so vast that replacement costs were less important than operational speed. For Japanese forces, accustomed to repairing and reusing equipment until it literally fell apart, the implications were profound and disturbing. The Japanese military culture had always emphasized spiritual strength over material advantage. The concept of Yamato Damashi, the Japanese spirit, was believed to be capable of overcoming any material disadvantage through superior will, training, and dedication. This philosophy had served Japan well in its earlier conflicts against Russia in 1904 to 1905 and in its campaigns in China. But the Pacific War was revealing the limitations of this approach against an enemy with seemingly limitless resources. Japanese soldiers and sailors were indeed demonstrating extraordinary courage and skill, but they were being overwhelmed by the sheer volume of American materiel. It was like trying to hold back the ocean with willpower alone. Intelligence reports flowing back to Tokyo painted an increasingly grim picture. American shipyards were launching vessels faster than Japanese submarines could sink them. American factories were producing ammunition faster than Japanese forces could expend it, even in the most intensive combat operations. American training facilities were producing pilots, mechanics, and specialists at rates that suggested an unlimited supply of both human and material resources. By late 1943, some Japanese military leaders were privately questioning whether victory was still possible. General Kuniaki Koiso, who would soon become prime minister, confided to close associates that the war had become a race between Japanese defensive capabilities and American productive capacity, and that America was winning that race decisively. The strategic implications were becoming impossible to ignore. Japan's original war plan had called for securing a defensive perimeter and making the cost of American counterattacks so high that a negotiated peace would become attractive. But this strategy depended on limiting American access to resources and bases. Instead, American forces seemed to have an endless supply of both. Every major American offensive operation demonstrated new levels of logistical sophistication. The Marshall Islands campaign in early 1944 involved coordination between hundreds of ships, thousands of aircraft, and tens of thousands of personnel, all supplied across thousands of miles of ocean with clockwork precision. Japanese observers noted that American task forces carried their own floating bases, complete with repair facilities, supply ships, and fuel tankers that could sustain operations for months without returning to port. Colonel Yamamoto had been following these developments with growing concern throughout 1943 and early 1944. As a staff officer responsible for logistics and supply, he understood better than most combat officers the mathematical realities behind Japan's increasingly desperate situation. His reports to higher headquarters had grown increasingly pessimistic, though he was careful to frame his concerns in terms of tactical challenges rather than strategic impossibilities. The Japanese military culture discouraged defeatist thinking, and officers who suggested that victory might be unattainable faced career consequences or worse. But the evidence was becoming undeniable to anyone willing to examine it objectively. Japan was fighting an enemy whose productive capacity seemed to increase with each passing month, while Japan's own resources were being steadily depleted by the demands of defending an overextended empire. It was against this backdrop of growing awareness and growing denial that Colonel Yamamoto found himself stationed on a small but strategically important island in the Central Pacific in mid-1944. The island, whose name would be lost to history in the broader sweep of the war, served as a forward supply depot for Japanese air operations in the region. It was here that he would make his shocking discovery about the true extent of American material superiority. The island had been selected as a supply base because of its natural harbor and its position along key shipping routes. Japanese engineers had spent months developing fuel storage facilities, ammunition depots, and repair shops to support air operations across the Central Pacific. The base represented a significant investment in scarce Japanese resources and engineering expertise. Colonel Yamamoto commanded a mixed force of about 800 men, combat engineers, logistics specialists, anti-aircraft gunners, and a small contingent of infantry for base security. They had been working steadily to expand the island's capacity to support Japanese air operations, which were becoming increasingly critical as American forces advanced across the Pacific. The men under Yamamoto's command were typical of Japanese forces in the later stages of the war, experienced, disciplined, but increasingly aware that they were fighting a losing battle. Mail from home spoke of rationing, air raids, and growing hardships on the home islands. Yet their training and culture demanded absolute loyalty and maximum effort, regardless of the strategic situation. It was July 1944 when American reconnaissance flights began appearing over the island with increasing frequency. Yamamoto knew what this meant. The island was being marked for capture as part of the continuing American advance across the Central Pacific. He began preparing his forces for the inevitable assault, following standard Japanese defensive doctrine that emphasized making the enemy pay as high a price as possible for every yard of ground. But the American attack, when it came, followed a pattern that Yamamoto had observed in previous campaigns. Overwhelming air and naval bombardment, followed by amphibious assault with massive logistical support. The sheer volume of firepower brought to bear against the island was staggering. For 3 days, American aircraft and warships pounded every known Japanese position with an intensity that seemed designed to eliminate all possibility of organized resistance. When the bombardment finally lifted and American landing craft approached the beaches, Yamamoto realized that his defensive positions had been systematically destroyed. His anti-aircraft guns had been silenced, his communication facilities had been wrecked, and his supply depots had been targeted with devastating precision. The attack demonstrated not just American firepower, but American intelligence capabilities that seemed to know the location of every significant Japanese installation on the island. Faced with overwhelming odds and no possibility of reinforcement, Yamamoto made a decision that would have been unthinkable earlier in the war. He ordered his surviving forces to withdraw to predetermined positions in the island's interior, abandoning the coastal defenses and supply facilities to the advancing Americans. This tactical withdrawal was not a retreat in the traditional sense, but rather a strategic repositioning designed to allow his forces to continue resistance from concealed positions. Japanese military doctrine called for fighting to the death, but Yamamoto had concluded that immediate destruction of his forces would serve no strategic purpose. Better to preserve his men for guerrilla operations that might delay American use of the island's facilities. The American landing proceeded with mechanical efficiency that impressed even the Japanese defenders. Within hours of the initial assault, American engineers were already at work, repairing the harbor facilities and runway that the Japanese had spent months constructing. The speed and scale of the American engineering effort was remarkable. They seemed to have an unlimited supply of bulldozers, cranes, and other heavy equipment, along with the specialists needed to operate them. From his hidden observation post in the island's hills, Yamamoto watched American supply ships begin arriving even before the last Japanese positions had been cleared. The logistics operation was unlike anything he had witnessed in his military career. Ships would dock, discharge their cargo with mechanical efficiency, and depart to make room for the next vessel in what appeared to be an endless convoy. But it was the fuel supply operation that truly captured Yamamoto's attention. American tanker ships began pumping aviation fuel directly into storage tanks that their engineers had constructed with remarkable speed. The volume of fuel being moved was extraordinary, more in a single day than his own forces had received in months of supply operations. As Yamamoto observed the American logistics operation from concealment, he began to understand something fundamental about the nature of the war his country was fighting. This wasn't simply a matter of American forces being better supplied. It was evidence of an industrial and logistical system operating on a scale that made Japanese supply operations look primitive by comparison. The Americans weren't just bringing enough supplies to sustain their operations on the island. They were building up reserves that suggested they viewed fuel, ammunition, and equipment as essentially unlimited resources. Where Japanese forces carefully hoarded every gallon of fuel and every round of ammunition, American forces seemed to operate under the assumption that there would always be more supplies available than they could possibly use. This casual abundance extended to every aspect of the American operation. Yamamoto observed American soldiers discarding equipment that Japanese forces would have considered valuable, replacing functioning gear simply because newer versions were available. American mess facilities served food that would have been considered luxurious by Japanese standards, and medical facilities provided care that surpassed what was available in many Japanese civilian hospitals. But the fuel situation remained the most telling indicator of American capabilities. Day after day, tanker ships arrived to top off storage tanks that already appeared to be full. The Americans were building up fuel reserves far beyond what would be needed for normal operations. They were preparing for sustained air operations on a scale that dwarfed anything the Japanese military had ever attempted. It was during the second week of American occupation that opportunity presented itself. A combination of weather, American operational demands, and Japanese knowledge of the island's geography allowed Yamamoto's forces to mount a surprise raid on the American fuel depot. The operation was planned not as a decisive blow against American forces, but as a way to capture desperately needed supplies for continued resistance operations. The raid was executed with the precision that characterized Japanese military operations throughout the war. Yamamoto's men had spent days studying American patrol patterns, identifying weak points in perimeter security, and planning approach routes that would minimize their exposure to American firepower. The attack would need to be swift and surgical. Get in, take what they could carry, and withdraw before American forces could mount an effective response. What Yamamoto's raiders discovered would change everything. The American fuel depot contained not just enough aviation fuel to supply a major air operation, but reserves that suggested the Americans viewed fuel as an essentially unlimited resource. 25,000 gallons of high-octane aviation fuel, stored in hundreds of standard 55-gallon drums, each one bearing manufacturing stamps that indicated production dates just weeks earlier. But it wasn't just the quantity of fuel that shocked Yamamoto. It was the casual way it had been stored and guarded. This massive cache of precious aviation fuel, more than his entire air regiment had received in the past 6 months, was protected by a minimal security force and stored in a facility that suggested the Americans considered it routine supplies rather than a strategic resource. As his men began the dangerous work of moving as many fuel drums as possible to concealed locations, Yamamoto found himself calculating implications that went far beyond the tactical value of captured supplies. If the Americans could abandon fuel dumps like this, and intelligence reports suggested they had done so repeatedly during their advance across the Pacific, what did that say about their total production capabilities? The mathematics were staggering and horrifying. If this single depot represented routine supply reserves, then American fuel production must be operating on a scale that made Japanese petroleum resources look insignificant. And fuel was just one component of modern military operations. If Americans could treat aviation fuel so casually, what did that suggest about their production of aircraft, weapons, ammunition, and all the other materials needed to sustain military operations? Standing among those hundreds of fuel drums as his men worked to move them to safety, Colonel Yamamoto experienced what he would later describe as a moment of perfect clarity. This wasn't just captured supplies. It was concrete evidence of an industrial capability so vast that Japanese victory was not just unlikely, but mathematically impossible. The war wasn't being fought between Japanese spiritual strength and American material resources. It was being fought between Japanese spiritual strength and American industrial capacity that seemed to have no practical limits. And in that kind of war, courage and skill could delay defeat, but could not prevent it. As dawn broke over the island and Yamamoto's raiders completed their dangerous mission, the colonel found himself faced with a realization that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Japan wasn't just losing the war. Japan had been doomed from the moment it chose to fight an enemy whose productive capabilities were so vast that they treated as disposable what Japan considered precious beyond measure. The 25,000 gallons of captured fuel would help sustain Japanese resistance on the island for several more weeks. But for Colonel Yamamoto, those fuel drums had revealed a truth more devastating than any military defeat. Japan was fighting a war it could never win against an enemy whose resources were as limitless as the ocean itself. The captured fuel drums sat in carefully concealed caves scattered across the island's interior, each one a testament to American industrial might that Colonel Yamamoto could no longer ignore. But as he distributed this precious resource among his remaining aircraft, 3 battered Zero fighters that represented the entirety of his air power, a bitter irony wasn't lost on him. These 25,000 gallons, which would sustain Japanese air operations for months, represented perhaps an hour's production from American refineries. In the days following the raid, Yamamoto found himself transformed from a logistics officer focused on immediate tactical needs into an unwilling prophet of Japan's inevitable defeat. The evidence was literally stacked around him in hundreds of fuel drums, each one stamped with production codes that told a story of American manufacturing capacity operating at scales he had never imagined possible. But understanding the truth and acting on it were two very different things. Yamamoto was still a Japanese officer, bound by duty, honor, and a military culture that viewed acknowledgement of defeat as the ultimate betrayal. Even as the mathematical certainty of Japan's doom became clear to him, he continued to fulfill his responsibilities with the same dedication that had defined his entire military career. The fuel cache allowed Japanese forces on the island to mount several successful air raids against American positions, temporarily disrupting the steady flow of supplies that had so impressed Yamamoto during his observations. His 3 Zero fighters, now adequately fueled for extended operations, managed to damage 2 American transport ships and destroy several aircraft on the ground before American air defenses adapted to the new threat. These tactical victories provided a brief morale boost for Yamamoto's men, who had grown accustomed to operating under severe resource constraints. For a few weeks they could fight the kind of war they had trained for, aggressive, well-supplied operations that emphasized Japanese tactical superiority over American material advantages. The captured fuel had temporarily leveled the playing field. But even as his pilots celebrated their renewed capability to mount effective sorties, Yamamoto couldn't shake the larger implications of what he had witnessed. The American response to Japanese air attacks was swift and devastating. Within days, additional fighter squadrons had been deployed to the island, anti-aircraft defenses had been reinforced, and American patrols had been expanded to prevent future raids on supply depots. The speed and scale of the American response drove home another uncomfortable truth. The United States could absorb tactical defeats without any significant impact on their overall operations. The supplies destroyed in Yamamoto's raids were replaced within days. The damaged ships were quickly repaired or replaced, and American operations continued with barely a pause. For Japanese forces, by contrast, every loss was irreplaceable. The 3 Zero fighters operating from the island represented months of production from Japanese aircraft factories, that were already struggling to maintain output under increasing pressure from American bombing raids. When one of the Zeros was lost during a raid on American positions, it couldn't be replaced. It simply reduced Japanese air capability by 33%. This asymmetry extended to every aspect of the conflict. American pilots shot down over the island were quickly replaced by new aviators, fresh from training schools in the United States. Japanese pilots, when lost, took with them hundreds of hours of irreplaceable training and experience. American mechanics had access to complete inventories of spare parts and replacement equipment. Japanese maintenance crews had to fabricate parts from salvaged materials and keep aircraft flying through ingenuity rather than adequate supplies. As the weeks passed and his fuel reserves were gradually consumed, Yamamoto began documenting his observations in detailed reports that he hoped might somehow reach higher headquarters. These reports, written in the careful language required by military protocol, nevertheless contained stark assessments of American capabilities that painted a picture of overwhelming enemy advantages in every category of military resources. Enemy logistics operations demonstrate production capacity exceeding previously estimated levels by factors of 10 or more, Yamamoto wrote in one report. Fuel, ammunition, and equipment reserves suggest strategic planning based on resource abundance rather than conservation. Enemy replacement rates for personnel and equipment indicate training and manufacturing systems operating at maximum capacity with significant reserve capabilities. But Yamamoto's reports, like similar assessments from Japanese officers throughout the Pacific, would never reach the decision-makers in Tokyo who might have acted on such intelligence. American submarine warfare had made communication with the home islands increasingly difficult and unreliable. Many detailed intelligence reports were lost when the ships or aircraft carrying them were intercepted by American forces. Even when such reports did reach higher headquarters, they faced a military and political culture that was increasingly resistant to negative assessments of Japan's strategic position. By late 1944, accurate reporting of American capabilities was often dismissed as defeatist thinking that undermined morale and fighting spirit. Officers who persisted in submitting pessimistic intelligence assessments found themselves reassigned or disciplined. This institutional resistance to uncomfortable truths meant that Japan's leadership continued to base strategic decisions on outdated estimates of American production capacity and flawed assumptions about American resolve. While officers like Yamamoto were discovering the true scale of American industrial might through direct observation, the information they gathered was not reaching the people who needed it most. The disconnect between field observations and strategic planning had profound consequences for Japanese war planning. Throughout 1944, Tokyo continued to develop defensive strategies based on assumptions that American advances could be halted or significantly delayed through determined resistance. These plans failed to account for the reality that American forces could simply overwhelm Japanese positions through sheer volume of firepower and supplies. Yamamoto witnessed this disconnect firsthand when he received orders to prepare for a major Japanese counteroffensive designed to recapture several strategic islands in the Central Pacific. The operation, planned by staff officers who had never seen American logistics operations in action, called for concentrated air and naval attacks that would require fuel and ammunition resources far exceeding what Japanese forces actually possessed in the region. Reading these operational orders while surrounded by evidence of American material superiority, Yamamoto experienced a profound sense of disconnection from his own military hierarchy. The plans he was being asked to support were based on assumptions about enemy capabilities that he knew to be completely inaccurate. Yet military discipline prevented him from directly challenging orders that he knew were founded on false premises. Instead, Yamamoto found himself implementing impossible orders with the same dedication he had always shown, even as he privately calculated the inevitable failure of operations that ignored mathematical realities. His reports dutifully outlined the steps he was taking to prepare for the planned counteroffensive, while carefully noting resource constraints that made success highly unlikely. The planned Japanese counteroffensive never materialized. American intelligence had intercepted enough Japanese communications to understand the general outline of the operation, and preemptive American airstrikes systematically destroyed the fuel and ammunition stockpiles that would have been needed to sustain the attack. Within days, the carefully assembled Japanese forces found themselves fighting a defensive battle against American offensives that seemed to anticipate their every move. This pattern of failed Japanese operations and successful American counterattacks became increasingly common throughout late 1944 and early 1945. American intelligence capabilities, combined with overwhelming material advantages, allowed American forces to consistently stay ahead of Japanese strategic planning. Every Japanese attempt to concentrate forces for a decisive blow was met by American responses that demonstrated both superior intelligence and unlimited resources to counter Japanese moves. For Yamamoto, observing this pattern from his isolated island base, the futility of continued resistance became increasingly apparent. Yet the alternative, surrender or withdrawal, remained unthinkable within the context of Japanese military culture. Officers who suggested that resistance might be futile faced immediate disciplinary action, or worse. The military code demanded fighting to the death, regardless of strategic circumstances. This cultural imperative created a profound psychological burden for officers who understood the mathematical impossibility of Japanese victory, but remained bound by duty to continue hopeless resistance. Yamamoto's personal writings from this period, recovered after the war, reveal a man struggling with the conflict between intellectual honesty and military loyalty. "We continue operations that we know cannot succeed against an enemy whose resources appear limitless," he wrote in a letter to his wife that was never sent. "Honor demands that we fight, but reason suggests that we are simply prolonging inevitable defeat while causing unnecessary suffering for our men and our people." This internal conflict was shared by many Japanese officers in the war's final stages. Intelligence reports, direct observation, and mathematical analysis all pointed to the same conclusion. Continued resistance would only delay defeat, while increasing casualties on both sides. Yet military culture and political pressure demanded continued fighting regardless of strategic realities. The psychological toll of this impossible situation was evident in the behavior of Japanese forces throughout the Pacific. Increasingly desperate defensive tactics, including organized charges against overwhelming odds and the emergence of organized ending-of-life attacks, reflected not just military desperation, but also the profound psychological strain of fighting a war that intelligent officers knew could not be won. On Yamamoto's island, this psychological pressure manifested in different ways among his men. Some embraced increasingly reckless tactics, seeking honorable death in combat, rather than prolonged, hopeless resistance. Others focused obsessively on their immediate duties, performing routine maintenance and supply tasks, with fanatical attention to detail as a way of avoiding larger strategic questions. Yamamoto himself found solace in detailed technical analysis of American operations, documenting every aspect of enemy logistics and tactical procedures with scientific precision. These studies served no immediate military purpose, but they provided a sense of intellectual control over circumstances that were otherwise completely beyond Japanese influence. His analysis of American fuel operations alone filled hundreds of pages of meticulous notes. He calculated consumption rates, transportation methods, storage procedures, and quality control measures with the dedication of an academic researcher. The 25,000 gallons of captured fuel became the foundation for a comprehensive study of American petroleum logistics that revealed the true scale of enemy industrial capacity. According to Yamamoto's calculations, the fuel depot his forces had raided represented approximately 2 hours of production from American refineries. The casual abundance he had observed, fuel stored with minimal security and abandoned during tactical withdrawals, suggested that American petroleum production was operating with significant excess capacity. Even accounting for global military demands, the United States appeared to be producing far more fuel than required for current operations. This excess capacity had strategic implications that extended far beyond immediate military operations. American forces could afford to be wasteful with fuel because replacement supplies were essentially guaranteed. Japanese forces, operating with carefully rationed fuel supplies, had to balance every tactical decision against resource conservation requirements. The psychological and operational advantages of fighting without resource constraints were impossible to quantify but clearly significant. Similar patterns emerged in every category of military supplies. American ammunition consumption during routine training exercises exceeded the total ammunition production of some Japanese arsenals. American spare parts inventories for routine maintenance contained more resources than entire Japanese supply depots. American medical supplies included medications and equipment that Japanese forces had learned to do without entirely. But perhaps most revealing was American personnel replacement capacity. Throughout 1944 and 1945, American forces maintained consistent unit strength despite heavy casualties in major operations. New personnel arrived regularly, already trained to high standards and equipped with the latest weapons and equipment. Japanese forces, by contrast, found it increasingly difficult to replace casualties with adequately trained personnel. Yamamoto observed this personnel replacement system firsthand during several American operations around his island base. Combat units that had suffered significant casualties during amphibious landings were reinforced within days by fresh troops who appeared to be as well trained and equipped as the original forces. The speed and efficiency of American personnel replacement suggested training systems operating on a scale that dwarfed Japanese military education capabilities. American training programs, according to intercepted communications and captured documents, were producing specialists in every military occupation at rates that seemed almost impossible. Radio operators, mechanics, medics, pilots, and technical specialists were being trained in numbers that exceeded total Japanese military personnel in some categories. The implications were staggering. American forces could afford to use highly trained specialists for routine tasks because replacement personnel were always available. This abundance of trained personnel allowed American forces to operate with a level of technical sophistication that Japanese forces could rarely match. Complex equipment that would have required careful preservation and expert maintenance in Japanese service was treated as routine and replaceable by American forces. Damaged equipment was often abandoned rather than repaired, simply because replacement was more efficient than recovery and maintenance. The psychological impact of this material abundance on American personnel was equally significant. American soldiers and sailors operated with a confidence that came from knowing that adequate supplies, equipment, and support would always be available. Japanese forces, accustomed to operating with limited resources and uncertain supply lines, could never achieve the same level of operational confidence. Yamamoto documented instances of American forces abandoning positions that were perfectly defensible simply because maintaining them would require more resources than establishing new positions elsewhere. This casual approach to resource utilization reflected a strategic mindset based on unlimited material availability, a mindset that was completely alien to Japanese military thinking. As 1945 began, and American forces prepared for what appeared to be final operations against the Japanese home islands, Yamamoto found himself documenting evidence of American capabilities that suggested the war's outcome had been predetermined from the moment Japan chose to attack Pearl Harbor. The mathematical realities he had discovered through captured fuel supplies extended to every aspect of American military capacity. American bomber production alone exceeded total Japanese aircraft production by factors of 10 or more. American shipbuilding programs were launching vessels faster than Japanese submarines could target them, even if Japanese submarine operations had been completely successful. American training programs were producing military personnel faster than Japanese combat operations could inflict casualties, even in the most optimistic scenarios for Japanese defensive operations. The final revelation came in March 1945. When American forces began systematic bombing of Japanese industrial facilities using long-range bombers operating from bases that demonstrated the ultimate expression of American logistical capabilities. These bombing operations required fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and personnel on scales that exceeded the total resources available to entire Japanese military districts. Watching formations of American bombers pass overhead on their way to targets in the home islands, Yamamoto realized that Japan was facing an enemy whose productive capacity was so vast that routine operations required resources that would have represented strategic reserves for Japanese forces. The war wasn't being decided by superior tactics or better training. It was being decided by industrial capacity that operated on scales beyond Japanese comprehension. The 25,000 gallons of captured fuel that had seemed like such a significant tactical advantage just months earlier now appeared insignificant compared to the fuel requirements for American bombing operations that involved hundreds of aircraft flying thousands of miles to deliver attacks that consumed more ordnance in single missions than Japanese factories could produce in weeks. In his final report, written in the days before American forces completed their occupation of his island, Colonel Yamamoto attempted to summarize the lessons learned from months of observing American operations. His conclusions were stark and undeniable. Japan had chosen to fight a war against an enemy whose resources were effectively unlimited, and no amount of courage, skill, or determination could overcome such fundamental mathematical disadvantages. The fuel we captured revealed not just enemy abundance, but enemy waste, he wrote. They can afford to be wasteful because their production exceeds their consumption by margins we cannot match. We cannot win a war of attrition against an enemy whose industrial capacity makes our entire war effort appear insignificant by comparison. When American forces finally overran the last Japanese positions on the island in April 1945, they found among Yamamoto's papers detailed studies of American logistics operations that provided the most comprehensive analysis of American industrial capacity produced by any Japanese military officer during the war. These documents, recovered by American intelligence officers, revealed the profound psychological impact that American material superiority had on thoughtful Japanese military leaders. Colonel Yamamoto survived the war and returned to Japan, where he spent his remaining years working as an industrial consultant, helping to rebuild Japanese manufacturing capacity. He never spoke publicly about his wartime realization that Japan's defeat had been mathematically inevitable, but his private papers, donated to a military history archive after his death in 1978, provided historians with unique insights into how intelligent Japanese officers understood the true nature of the war they were fighting. The 25,000 gallons of American fuel that Yamamoto's forces captured in 1944 had served its immediate tactical purpose, extending Japanese resistance on one small Pacific island for several additional weeks. But the broader lesson revealed by that captured fuel, that Japan was fighting an enemy whose resources were so vast that they treated as disposable what Japan considered precious, would prove to be one of the war's most profound and tragic revelations. Today, as we study the Pacific War and seek to understand how such devastating conflicts develop and conclude, Colonel Yamamoto's story serves as a reminder that wars are ultimately decided not just by courage and determination, but by the cold mathematics of industrial capacity and resource availability. His realization, standing among those fuel drums on a forgotten Pacific island, captured in one moment the larger tragedy of a war that had been decided before it truly began. The lesson of those 25,000 gallons echoes across history, that understanding your enemy's true capabilities, rather than wishful thinking about their limitations, remains one of the most critical requirements for any nation contemplating war. Colonel Yamamoto learned that lesson too late to change the outcome, but his story ensures that future generations might remember it in time to choose a different path.